Okay, so I have heard political scientists argue and talk about and present, like the Machiavellian theory and talk about political science 101, and they talk about betrayal being the currency of politics. And one of the things that they talk about is that Machiavellian theory actually insinuates that every time a king has come into power, he has to silence all the kings in waiting and all the princes and all the power brokers and all the kingmakers that made the king. He has to eliminate all of them and kill all of them, not literally. But I am not a surface guy. I always like digging below the surface to be able to understand and to expose what is happening. So what even your professor of political science will not tell you is that there is a reason why that philosophy got the front page. The reason why that philosophy got the front page is because it was consistent with the practical state of affairs, or rather, it had been proven over time that the reality and the practice of politics reflects the truth of that particular theory. But I want to have you understand how that theory got further and how that theory was fed. That theory, or the reality that justifies that theory, comes into being on account of two things. On account of the fact that, one, the king does not have the monopoly of likability, does not have the monopoly of resources, does not have the monopoly of strategy, and does not have the monopoly of calling all the shots that are necessary for a political victory, or even, let's just say, the tools to ascend to power. And as a result, the king will make use of other forces, will make use of other resources available, and these resources are brought on the table by persons. So there is a lot of human resource or human persons that bring on board financial resource and intellectual resources, which are necessary for the perpetuation of the pursuit of power by the king or by the political leader. Now, once this power has been attained, the practice, which may be a good practice or a bad practice altogether, is the fact that the kingmakers, the people who bring human resource, human capital, financial resource, and intellectual resource, they are the people who now end up feeling entitled to that throne. And they behave in a manner to suggest that if it were not for me, you would not have gotten. So you will hear William Ruto say that if it were not for me, Uhuru Kenyatta would not have gotten into power. So there is truth in it, and there is an element of entitlement to it. Now, the other reality is that these people who are entitled, the reason why politicians say that the only constant thing in politics is interest. There are no permanent enemies, but interest can always be permanent for as long as you have common interests. So interests and political interests and the permanent nature of political interests are such that these people who bring human, intellectual, and financial resource to the table of the king for purposes of the pursuit of power will always come on board with the interests. And their interests become their undoing, because their interests can easily then hold the king hostage. They had interests in certain sectoral preferences. They had interest in future political pursuits. So when you say Kibaki Tosha, you are hoping that they will scratch your back at the appropriate time. Or there were negotiations, like the constitutional review, like the creation of the office of the prime minister and all these other things. And so immediately the king gets into power, the king has two choices. Number one, to be held hostage by the kingmakers and the kings in waiting, because the kingmakers had interests in the first place before they even came on board, or they came on board because they felt that their interests could be met in that particular campaign. So once the king gets into power, these people already have their interest as a priority. And so factually, when you escalate this argument, you will realize that the king does not have the monopoly of implementing his own ideas. The ideas and the priorities with which he came into power are therefore subservient to the or if they are not subservient, then they are at par with the interests of the kingmakers and the persons who brought in intellectual, financial, and human resource to make the pursuit of power a possibility. And on that account alone, it means that the king will therefore be held hostage by these particular interests. And on that account, then the king has a choice as to whether he will wield the complete elements, the complete embodiment, the epitome of the symbols and the tools of power, or whether he shall be a puppet of the king makers. It is for that reason that the practicality then became that the only way the king is going to rule on his terms and to achieve the ideas that he had is to kill all the king makers and to also kill the kings in waiting, because the kings in waiting will serve you, but there is no guarantee as to whether they are being loyal to your own priorities, because most at times they will serve you, but they will be doing what Absalom was doing. Absalom was the son of the King David in the Bible. And so Absalom will sit in the gate and people will come with their complaints, and then he will tell the people that, oh, I really sympathize with you. You are in my thoughts. You are in my prayers. If only the king was available to listen to this. He was trying to say that the king is not rising to the occasion. It was as good as somebody that I know who was serving the king, but he would go to the people and say that, you know, the king sleeps up to 11 a.m. because the king drinks too much, and it is me who is running the government because I am sober 24/7 and I have the energy. So what happens is that the prince, who is a king in waiting, can actually be an Absalom of the Davidic moments in the Bible, who says that if only the king was like me, if only the king was as good as me, if only the king was as caring as me, then your problem would have been solved. But you see, I am not the king. I can't help you. I am not the king. I can't help your problem. It is for such reasons and for such practicality that Machiavellian argues, and truthfully so, that once the king gets into power, he has two choices. That if he does, of course, he just says you kill the kings in waiting and all the king makers and all those people who have interests in the throne, because they will not serve you with the priority of your interests, but rather they will serve you with their own interests and the priority of their interests. But my argument is that the only other way you can let them stay around is to agree to be subservient to them and to be a hostage of the kingmakers and the kings in waiting. So what am I trying to say? I am saying that one of the things that Jimmy Wanjigi needs to understand, and I hope he's listening to me, is that if he truly wants to be presidential material for the future, he is presidential material, but not for 2022. A lot has happened. A lot of what has gone under the bridge. The dynamics have changed, and the discussion has already shaped it. You know, in politics, the discussion is not even, how do I argue it? That people shape discussions, but after they have shaped discussions, they get echoes from the people. And when people echo, they either echo to agree with you, to disagree with you, or to tell you new things. And then after the echo, the sound bounces back again. The campaign shapes itself afresh. So if you ask me, the campaign ideas and the campaign issues already went to the people, echoed back, and a new messaging has already gone. And you already lost the first phase of sending the primary message. And simply because you are not part of the equation that sent out the primary message, it will be difficult, almost impossible, to be able to craft a new message on the basis of the echo. That being the case, Jimmy Wanjigi must agree with me that the principle of the Machiavellian theory, whereby he invested in the Huruto and the Raila campaigns, has already come to bear fruit, that there was no way Raila was moving forward except to betray him. On that principle alone, then he is a true enigma. And upon agreeing with this reality, then Jimmy Wanjigi needs to make a decision on how he is going to negotiate his next path into the future, which will be 2027. And there are two ways of doing it. One, he can do it by himself from the ground. Two, because he has chosen that he is in ODM, let him do. If you know, they say, if the mountain doesn't come to you, you go to the mountain. In the previous discussion, I have said what Baba needs to do to appease Wanjigi. So if the mountain does not come to you, go to the mountain and achieve the same results. And that's what Jimmy Wanjigi needs to do if he wants to be a serious contender for the next political dispensation. And then he can play the role that he wants to institutionalize. So let him not be too selfish to make himself the standard. Let him not make himself the SI unit of constitutionalism. Let him not make himself the yardstick for democracy in ODM. But then just ask the question, how can we make sure that there is democracy in ODM? And there are many other channels that he can use, including the process that will do the nominations for the candidates in ODM, especially when he is not a factor himself. He will be more objective than being subjectively a candidate for the same process, because chances are high that the temptation to be biased or even break the same rules he seems to want to perpetuate, the probability are almost one, that while advocating for democracy, he could actually himself shoot himself in the foot and actually betray the tenets of the very democracy, especially when he is a subject of interest. That we should be able to agree. So those were just my thoughts, just putting my value on the table. Nobody knows how sweet a mango is until they have tasted one. And so I have to let my brains be known. That is the only way anyone will know how good my God-given brains are. Shalom. God bless you all. And I do love you. Of course, it is the showstopper, Mr. Leopard. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, Mr. Leopard TV, for this kind of deep thinking, ahead of time insights. God bless you guys.